going on here, man? Yeah, you need that, man. I saw your channel was all messed up. Everyone was complaining about your one, man.
This is a bit dodgy, like explosive.
So yeah, because I think if you look in the dictionary at the word what barbarism means, yeah. Barbarism has two definitions. One is like something which is cruel, something which is generally cruel, and the other thing is if something is lacking in civilization or something like this. Yeah, I don't know why they put that into the dictionary, but let's take the first definition, right? Is it true that there are some things in the Quranic discourse and in the Hadith discourse which are barbaric? Taking that definition, that English definition, that lexical definition in the dictionary of barbarism is something which is cruel. I would agree. I would say that there are some things in the Islamic discourse which are barbaric. There are. But the thing is, here's the point to question now, because okay, your religion is barbaric. There are parts of it which are. I would argue it's a very small part. I would argue it's a very, very small part, which are barbaric, right? Which are cruel. This word has negative connotations, right?
Sorry, can you give us an example?
So as I was just mentioning, the verse in the Quran, which I explained to her, it's not something which, if you put it in the context of today, would implement in the same way as, say, for example, if you put it in the context of another place and time. But the verse in the Quran where it says, وَالسَّارِقُ وَالسَّارِقَةُ فَاقْطَعُوا أَيْدِيهُمَا جَزَاءً بِمَا كَسَبَ نَكَالًا مِنَ اللَّهِ, where it says that the thief, the male and the female thief, cut their hands off, right? So this punitive law, you could argue, is a barbaric punitive law. From that perspective, from that lexical perspective, because it's cruel. No doubt it's cruel. Now what I'm saying is that no doubt it has its place in the Islamic discourse and it's not implementable in all cases and times. Someone says, okay, it's barbaric to cut someone's hand off, okay? This is an argument. First thing we would say is that, first and foremost, as I've just mentioned, it's not implementable in all cases. Like, for example, if someone has stolen something which is not of value, or if it's poverty, or if it's an economic recession or whatever, and even obviously in our day and time, this is not applicable to us in the West, yeah? However, I'll say fine, it says that in the Quran, so what? The question would be is like, how does barbarism entail falsity? How does cruelty mean something is... Do you know what we should be asking? We should be asking, this is the question we should ask, what is the most socio-economic, you could say socially or economic, effective way to govern? I would say this, I mean, it depends on your, look, this is why there's a difference, I would say, from the Quranic method and the liberal, you could say, like in the liberal Western context, it's a different approach. The reason why is because from the Islamic perspective, community is preferred over individual. Society is preferred over the community. And Allah is preferred over all of this. When you have this kind of ontology, right, everything is different. The liberal thesis is that the individual is preferred over everything else. That's why we live in an individualized society, right? So if we're comparing, this is the thing. This is what you have to understand. Let me tell you something. I agree, look.
But here's the thing, at the time of the Prophet, did they have jail where they could put people?
That's a really good question.
Because if
They didn't. As far as my reading goes,
so we should change now.
no, look, I'm not saying that because we didn't have jails then, we shouldn't have jails now, okay? For example, at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, they had prisoners of war. We don't have prisoners of war now. A lot of people accuse Islam of being a religion which enables slavery, yeah? You've heard this. It's a religion which enables slavery. The truth is this. Those individuals that were taken in from the Prophet and the Sahaba were literally prisoners of war. Yeah, they were prisoners of war. The fact that we didn't have jails is a really interesting point, because where would you put the prisoners? If you don't have a prison, you have to put them in some kind of other alternative placement. So in the case of the Prophet, he put them in houses, in people's homes, okay? So people would take them, as prisoners. And by the way, there are laws of how they can ransom themselves. Pardon? The thing is this, when we talk about slavery today, and this is my genuine belief on it, yeah? When we talk about slavery today, we have very set understanding of what slavery is, yeah? We've had the triangular trade or the transatlantic trade experience. We know what cattle slavery looks like. We know chattel slavery. We know what that looks like. So that Islam has never come to to promote.
So would you say these prisoners of war remain as these
I would say that they were like indentured servants. Yeah.
Is it like
So
a punishment for a duration of time, or do they just that's where they reside forever?
that's a good question. So this is a good point. So the prisoners of war that we were talking about, and this is a good point, yeah. So about slavery, and this is a question now which is very pertinent. I'll mention it and go back to what I was talking about the model, Islamic model in general, because it's a different model. It has a different governmental model, and you have to understand that the presuppositions of both of those things are different. Like we have different presuppositions. Yeah. So here, the thing is, at the time of the Prophet and Islam, in the Quran, generally speaking, it says, وَمَا أَذْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةِ فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ. What would make you know what the good way is? And then it says, freeing slaves is a good way. Freeing slaves is the good way. So no one can come about and say, unless this verse is somehow abrogated, which is not, because it's not a hukum anyways. No one can say this verse is not applicable, and that Islam is trying to promote slavery. If someone does say that, we will just reply. In Surah Al-Balad, chapter number 90 of the Quran, it says, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةِ فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ. This is a knockout argument, I believe. We say that how comes the Quran says, what would make you know what the good way is? Freeing slaves. That's point one, right? Point number two, then the question would be, then how, historically, and also through the Sharia, from Quran and Sunnah, we know that there were slaves that were taken in. And when I say slaves, I put it in this kind of, I'll tell you why. Because once again, when we use any term in English language, it's steeped in like a historical context. Yeah, and it has, what you call it, like a connotation attached to it, which is related to that context. So when we say slave, we're talking about black people being whipped in America. This has nothing to do with Islam. Yeah, so the system Islam had in place was a system of prisonership. It took prisoners and it put them in homes, because we didn't have, like you said, jails. We didn't have jails in Islam at the time of the Prophet. You didn't have that.
So did they just agree to stay there?
Pardon?
They just agreed to stay in these homes?
So no, they didn't agree to stay there. Islam gave them 2 or 3 options, and this is mentioned in chapter number 24, verse 33 of the Quran. One of the options that they had, if we knew that they were they were not a criminal or a threat to society, was an option called mukataba. Mukataba is when you ransom yourself. Now, if you go to America and you go to prison or jail, you can be ransomed sometimes. Yeah, not all the time, but sometimes you can be ransomed. Someone has to pay a certain amount of money, and then you can be ransomed. There are 2 opinions, and if you look at Tafsir al-Qurtubi, which is probably one of the best fiqhi tafsir of the Quran, yeah, in terms of jurisprudence, he says that there are 2 opinions, and this is really important. Yeah, really important. One opinion says this. One opinion says that if one of those indentured servants or prisoners of war, he asks for mukataba, he wants to be freed now. He says, I'm going to ransom, I'm going to pay the money, but I don't want to be in this position of imprisonment anymore. One opinion says, okay, it's up to the person who's imprisoning him. And this is the opinion of, like, say, a lot of the madhahib, okay, and it's quite a popular opinion. However, the other opinion, which goes back to some of the Zahiris, and goes back to actually some of the Sahaba and some of the Tabi'een, says that actually that slave is in his, or that indentured servant or whatever, is in his right to go to someone higher than that person, like the Qadi, the judge, and whether or not the owner or the prisoner or whatever you want to call him agrees, he has to be freed. Now this is particularly important if we take that second opinion for the sake of argument, for one reason. Now if we take that opinion, which is the zahir of the ayah, which means it's the apparent literal meaning of the ayah, it would suggest that really, even the system, the only one way that someone can become an indentured servant or a slave in the Islamic discourse, and I say slave like this, right, is through being a prisoner. There's no other way. And if this is the only way, and actually even in that context, the person can forcibly free themselves, then what kind of slavery is this? Because actually it's not really, it wouldn't be a slavery at all. The person would go and forcibly free themselves. But going back to our original points is that a problem or I would say a misappropriation that a lot of people make in terms of understanding Islam is when they put on their secular glasses or their liberal glasses or the democratic glasses and they try and look at Islam or measure Islam in accordance with that. Let me tell you something. If you do that, Islam will not measure up.
So you're saying you have to change your perspective?
You have to change your perspective, because the thing is this. The ruler of the West, and this is a post-colonial narrative, yeah? After the colonial, you have to understand that the Age of Discovery and the British Empire, these were not easy empires. They really had an encroachment of the earth. And the last colonial colony of Britain was like in the 50s. They're not just going to give all of that up easily, right? The Western world has a strong ideological encroachment on the rest of the world. It's because of its hegemonic power position, yeah? It wants us to believe what it believes. It just does, okay? It makes sense for its foreign policy, it makes sense for its domestic policy, it makes sense for its economic policies. What it believes now is not necessarily a religious framework. It's no longer the time of Christianity anymore. Christianity does not inform Western domestic or foreign policy anymore. It doesn't, yeah? Now it's secularism, now it's liberalism, now it's democracy. So the point is this. To what extent can we say that these ideologies are objective truths? And do the propounders of those ideologies or the philosophers that originally initiated them intend for them to be seen as objective truths? These ideologies were never intended to be seen as objective truths. So now, if you measure... No, what I'm saying is that, for example, the idea of liberalism, which was refined by like John Stuart Mill, you could say liberalism started with Thomas Hobbes. You could argue that with the Leviathan and continued up into J.S. Mill. And it was refined by him. The idea that you can do whatever you want so long as you don't harm anyone else, which is okay to some extent, but it's not what we go with. Yeah.
So you can't actually stop people from doing it. That's how if they want to do
Yeah, but we could say it's morally wrong, right?
Of course it's wrong.
Okay, but liberalism, on a liberal ideological framework, it wouldn't be wrong. It would just be an expression of someone's desires.
It would be wrong because the whole point of liberalism is individualism.
Yeah, exactly.
So subjectivity.
Right.
Recognizing subjectivity and kind of...
Right, I get that point, but then I would ask, how can we prove that is the truth?
We can't.
Well, we can't. Okay, good. Yeah, proof. Oh, good, excellent. So if we can't prove that that's something which is absolutely or objectively true, then measuring Islam according to it is like measuring something with a stretchy ruler. Okay, if you use a stretchy ruler to measure something, then you're never going to get a precise measurement. 100 years ago, today, women were not allowed to vote in this country, and there was a strong case. I mean, if you think about it, there was a strong case for it. If you look at the parliamentary records, how people were actually talking against women's rights, it was normal for women not to vote, and it was radical for women to be enfranchised, to speak. Yeah, if that is the case, look, 100 years, which is like one generation, has completely shaped the way we think about women's rights in society. 100 years, 100 years, right? In 1967, in this country, it was illegal to be homosexual. There was the death penalty in this country. That's some 50 years ago, yeah? We're talking about 50 years ago, homosexuality, and now homophobia. So everything is just turned up. So look at the stretchy ruler that we've got. Look at the stretchy ruler. Now you put this stretchy ruler and you're trying to establish if Islam is the truth with it, or if Islam is not compatible with my morals, my aesthetic value judgments, which are based on today's present day popular morality, then it's not true. I would say to you then, how are you sure that in 2057 or 2100, yeah, that we're not going to have a new set of morals that we're going to now have to change Islam to and stuff like that?
It will change.
Yeah.
Morals do change over time.
Right. So what I'm saying is that, yeah, of course.
Was Islam spread by the sword? If it was, can you give like explanation in which, and like, if it is, then surely that contradicts la ikraha fi din.
Okay.
Lakum dinukum waliya din. Do you know what I mean?
All right. So I'll answer that, but just let me finish off what I was saying here. Sorry. Yeah. So the Islamic thesis, in its essence, is a different thesis. The liberal thesis, it prioritizes the human being over and above everything else, right? The Islamic thesis prioritizes Allah over and above everything else. It's completely different. The difference, there's one main difference is this, is that Islam attempts to, do you know it's really interesting? Islam and the Quran has a method of falsification. Yeah, it does. It attempts to prove itself. Whereas liberalism, democracy, secularism does not even attempt that. It doesn't even attempt to do that.
Liberalism is not looking to be.
By the way, I'm not saying that liberalism as an ideology is all, practically speaking, is at odds with Islam. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that, generally speaking, its epistemological roots are different. The presuppositions of liberalism and the presuppositions of Islam are different.
The question we should ask is liberalism as an ideology trying to say this is absolute truth, or just trying to put.
Yeah, I'm saying if it's not, then the thing is, we're saying that Islam, the case for Islam is that it's an absolute truth. Okay, Islam as a framework, as a religion, attempts to prove that it's absolutely, objectively true. Liberalism, secularism, and all these other ideologies, they don't even attempt to do that.
They're not intending to.
Yes, exactly. Right. So we both agree with that, right? So why measure something which is attempting to be an ultimate truth with something which is not even the philosophers that propounded it didn't even intend for it to be an absolute truth. Do you get what I'm saying? It's a misplacement. So here, going back to, is Islam spread by the sword? The question is, what do you mean by spread by the sword? Right. So the truth is this: in a way it was, in a way it wasn't. Okay, how was it and how wasn't it? The way it was is that there was certainly, historically speaking, wars between countries and empires, including what was then the Islamic Empire, which meant for the expansion of Islam.
Okay, this is why I'm trying to say. You know how the Romans forced Christianity on the pagans in Britain, right? So that was like literally join or.
Yes.
Is that same with Islam? That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, not in the same way.
Like just face it.
No, not the same as the Romans, right? So, as I said to you before, Islam, and this has to be understood once again within what Clifford Geertz calls the thick description. He's a sociologist. Like he said that if you want to anthropologically understand any historical time period, you have to understand, in his words, the thick description. The thick description is literally the historical nuances of that particular time period. We lived in a time of the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire, the Persian Empire, yeah? This was, we were talking about 7th century Arabia. In that period of time, you could call it, in international relations, they call it the realist framework. The realist framework is literally when you have power as the main determiner for economic growth or otherwise movement or change, geopolitical change, yeah? So, basically, simply spoken, in the context of empires, when you have the Roman Empire, which is expanding, and the Sassanid Empire, which is expanding, it makes no sense from a foreign policy perspective to have an empire which is right in the middle of it, which attempts just to remain neutral and not expand. Right, so it will be engulfed in either of the two empires. In that context, Islam decided to premeditate an offensive against those two empires, and it successfully did so. How
do you know this? Where did you look to find this information?
Well, it's historical. Well, now we know that the Byzantine Empire became engulfed within the Islamic Empire, right? Byzantine Empire, basically, you can track this historically, and that's why in Syria now there are Muslims, and that's why in Jerusalem and all these places there are Muslims. So, anyways, demographically, you can see North Africa, yeah, is a Muslim region. A lot of that was because Amr ibn al-As and others went into Egypt, for example, and then they expanded. There's no doubt about that. We shouldn't lie about this or try and sugarcoat this. I mean, if we.
What do you mean by expanded?
So they expanded. Now, this is why I said yes or no. It was definitely an expansion, a military expansion, yeah? However, the general populace, as we said before, and you were asking about La ikraha fi din, yeah? The general populace were not asked to convert to Islam.
Oh, okay. So that means they weren't forced.
No, the people were not forced, but the governments were fought. The people were not forced, and it wouldn't make sense even from a logical perspective.
Why were they fought? Why were the governments fought?
The governments were fought, generally speaking, because one of the intended purposes of the Islamic Empire at the time was expansion. Just like the Persian Empire wanted to expand, the Roman Empire wanted to expand, the Islamic Empire wanted to expand. Why? Because if the Islamic Empire didn't want to, if it didn't expand, it would have been engulfed by the other empires. And by the way, this is not controversial. You know, only literally, maybe about 50 years ago, did the world say we don't want to do this anymore. The whole world, and you know, arguably so, the world is still doing. Let me tell you something. I believe this is the most uncontroversial reality of foreign policy, of international relations. For all of world's history, empires have been expanding. All of world empire, I don't know, an empire actually, by definition, is a civilization. What's the difference between civilization and empire? An empire is a civilization which attempts to expand its borders. That's what it is. An empire, by its very nature, is attempting expansion all the time. So when you had the Byzantine Empire, it was attempting to expand. When you had the Sassanid Empire, it was attempting to expand. In fact, they were fighting each other for it. Only up until, I mean, we talk about World War II. World War II was still talking about colonial expansion. There were still colonies involved in that war. We're talking about 50, 60 years ago, yeah? So, and you could argue now, and this is argued by Kalinikos and others, socialists, and also Gramsci and others. And this is very well argued. I agree with the argument here and the sentiment that the Americans are trying to expand. The only difference is this, right? Before, where empires were clearly defined, okay, this empire is trying to expand its powers and its military strength. Today, they're doing it through a variety of means, right? And they're disingenuous about it. Whereas before they were ingenuine about it, now they're disingenuous about it. So before, they would say, like, you would have a white man say, look, we're going to go to Africa and we're going to overtake Africa because we are better than the Africans. Now you have forked tongues politicians who say, no, who would say, look, we are liberals, we believe in individual rights. We believe in individual rights, yet at the same time, we need to go into Afghanistan and Iraq, all these countries, because we need to free them from their dictators. Is that really the reason why you're going into those countries? Why don't you go to Rwanda? So the question is this: Rwanda had a crisis, yeah? A very terrible crisis. So the question is this: as Montbois said, Montbois was one of the French strategists and military academics. He said that America has never been strategically consistent. America has never been morally consistent. It's always been strategically consistent. Do you get it? So the point is this: we have to now look. This question of expansion and stuff. Do you think that liberalism? Do you know the number one thing that shows that liberal governments have not been liberal and cannot be liberal is that Napoleon was a liberal. Do you think?
Every empire will define liberalism.
Right. Think about this for a second. Let's have a thought experiment, guys. Napoleon in the 1800s was a liberal. Can you imagine that? This was after the French Revolution. Napoleon was a liberal. The British Empire believed in liberalism. You know, a lot of the liberal philosophers came from Britain. Yet you had the colonial empire. So wait a minute. Do whatever you want, don't harm anyone else. Who does that apply to only? The white man. So that's what really has happened. Do whatever you want, so long as you don't harm anyone else. That applies within the domestic context of the white man's domain. But when it comes outwards, and when it's projected outwards to the rest of the world, no, we're empires. We're empires. And the only reason why now the British Empire is saying no more is because it was crushed after World War II and it had so much debt. And the Marshall Plan, all this, it couldn't continue its empire. That's the only reason why it's not an empire. Not because it suddenly realized, morally, yeah, as what you think, or other people might think, that, okay, liberalism is the truth now, we've been enlightened by this. No, it's because it could not continue its imperial legacy. That's all it is.
Is Islam for or against monarchy?
Monarchy, no, it's against monarchy. However, the Prophet said in the hadith, so yeah, just to kind of, the point is this, just to kind of wrap up what I was talking about, was Islam spread by the sword? In one way it was, because there was definitely a military conquest from the Arabian Peninsula outward. And another way it wasn't, because this rumor that people were forcibly converted to Islam is a rumor, and it's not historically proven. Say we find some historical...
How do you historically prove it?
It's difficult to historically prove it. Yeah, even if you can prove it historically, we'll say, even if you say, he said no record. Yeah.
Which record?
Yeah, it's a long history. It's a long history. Even if, let's for the argument's sake, say there were some, because look, Islamic history spans for about 1,400 years. Yeah. If we say there was some time in Morocco, Murabitin or the Muwahhidin or whatever, or if you say there was someone like the Fatimid Empire, the Ayyubids or whatever, that they forcibly, or the Ottomans or the Uthman, whatever you want, that they forcibly forced people to Islam, you say, okay, this was wrong. Simple. They shouldn't have.
Contradicts.
Yeah, it contradicts that, fine. So we will say if that happened, it's wrong and it shouldn't have happened. So 2 points. Islamic empire was acting like all the other empires at the time.
I know.
Do you get it? Number one.
It's like when Muslims do bad things, it's not representation of Islam.
Yes.
It's how they feel. I get it.
Exactly. So number one, Islam, the Islamic empire acted like any other empire. Had it not, it would have been unsuccessful.
It would have been wiped out.
Simple thing. It would have been unsuccessful. I wouldn't have been able to probably have this conversation with you right now. That's the truth, right? It would have been unsuccessful. Islam is a pragmatic religion which aims to offer solutions on every level. The individual level, the societal level, the communal level, and the foreign policy level. And had it not had these things in place where what you could call empire expansion was possible, then it would have been engulfed in other empires which would have forcibly forced people to become Christians or something else, yeah? So the point is this, in order for Islam to continue and to survive and to allow people to exist, yeah, it had this policy of expansion. Now, does it have to have the policy of expansion? Say for example, there was an Islamic state now. It doesn't have to have the policy of expansion. It goes around masalih and mafasid. It goes around what's beneficial at that particular time. It could do. At the end of the day, me being here right now is a form of me educating people to become Muslim. Yeah, educating people about Islam. You could argue that this is ideological expansionism in a sense. You could, and anything is ideological expansionism. What is ideological expansionism? Is when you have someone trying to not manipulate, but trying to get someone else to believe in what they believe in.
That is different. You're not like converting people
Yes,
out of
yes.
fear, like join or you.
Yeah, exactly, right. So, the point is, was Islam spread? So yes and no. It was spread by the sword in the sense that there were fighting between governments and imperial expansion, or you can say empire expansion, but no in the sense that, in fact, no one was coerced to become Muslim. And that was the reality of the world back then, and there was no... pardon?
You couldn't do that anyway.
Yeah, if you didn't do that, you would be drowning in imperial colonialism. You'd be colonized, right? And so that was a fair way. So what was the question you asked?
Yeah, okay, so the question is, the Quran is not enough to be read alone. Otherwise you'll have problems with فَضَرَبَهُنَّ and many how you can
Yeah,
take it
exactly.
however you want
Yeah,
to. However, when you come to the contextualization hadiths, there's fabrications in that. So are we just taking...
You asked a question before this.
Oh, the monarch. Is
Which
it
one?
for or against? And you said it's
Monarchy, yeah. So the Prophet said, is a prophecy. He says, and this is mentioned in Musnad Ahmad, where he says that the Prophet, the Khilafah Rashidiyah will stay 30 sana. It will be for 30 years. And then it says, ثم يكون ملكا بعد ذلك. After that, it's going to be a monarchy after that. And then it says, ثم يكون ملكا عاضا. Then it's going to be some kind of dictatorship.
Is this a prediction?
Yeah, so the Prophet's telling us what's going to happen. So let's actually look at what happened, yeah? 30 years, we had the 4 caliphs. If you add up the 4 caliphs, you have 30 years, right? And then you had the monarchy, you had the Umayyun, which are the Umayyads. Then you had, literally what we have now is a dictatorship. So it's actually, I mean, maybe a dictatorship or authoritarianism is probably a better translation, yeah? Literally something which is from biting down, you're biting down on someone, right? So literally like authoritarianism. So that's what we have. What should we have? Now this is a discussion that the Islamic, there's a difference, by the way, between what should be and what could be. And this discussion is found in books of Islamic politics like Ahkam al-Sultaniyya and by Mawardi and Al-Ghiyathi by Al-Juwayni and others. And so he says that he gives 9 conditions of someone who would be, and Mawardi gives 9 conditions of someone who can be the Khalif. And there are 9 conditions which we don't need to go through. But the point is this. Can there be an Islamic monarchy? Yes, there can be. Should there be an Islamic monarchy? Not really, because that's not the model that the Prophet allowed. But can it be? What we mean by can there be, say for example you have a situation where you have someone who is a monarch, yeah? And they've inherited a monarchy. Is that a legitimate governance in Islam? Yes, it is. Unless the person is not governing by Islam, it would be considered a legitimate governance in Islam. So that's that. But it would not be the preferred governance, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
What is the preferred?
Sorry.
So, going back previously when we were talking about the slaves, who frees them? It would be person who owns them or owns, you know what I mean? Or they go to the higher power. To
Yeah.
Who would you say would be ultimately in charge in enforcing the laws, and what structure and system would that take?
So yeah, I mean, once again, the actual structure could be variable. Like, we had different structures, but the general thing is that you have the Khalifa on top, then you have people that would be in charge of different wilayas. Then you have after that, this was the Khilafah Rashidiyya system, yeah. Then you have after that people that are underneath that, and then you have Qudaa. Qudaa are judges, literally like what we have today. We have judges, so they would go to judges. They wouldn't go to anything above that. They were judges in courts.
So would you say that's similar to having a monarchy where there's one person in charge?
No, it's not one person. You have more than one judge. You have different judges.
So there's one person at the top.
It's quite, look, a lot of people ask about what is the Islamic governance system. What is it actually? And some people have heard something, and I'm not refuting anyone here. I'm not refuting anyone. But a lot of people say Islam is democracy. It's not. Islam is not democracy. Democracy comes from a Greek construct, demos and kratia, meaning people power. And it was first experimented with in Athens, 3,000-4,000 years ago, whatever, yeah? Now, democracy, you have different types. In today's world, we have representative democracy. When we say democracy, we mean pluralism as well. Sometimes with the word democracy comes pluralism and liberalism. So sometimes the construct liberal democracy is used to describe this phenomena. Is Islam that? Is the Islamic system of governance that? No, it's not. It has its own system of governance whereby a leader is chosen by what you call Ahlul Halli wal Aqd. Ahlul Halli wal Aqdi are people who are literally, you could say, the highest of that particular community. So they could be higher. For example, they could be academics. So you can have professors. By the way, do you know what's really interesting? Yeah? Do you know what you think? Let me tell you what's really interesting. You know, because obviously in the classical Greek period, you had different philosophers. One of them was Socrates, yeah? And he said the following about democracy. His criticism of democracy is as follows. He said, why would you allow a whole community of people to vote on a specialist matter? Like, for example, he saw politics as a specialist matter. Like, you'd have to be aware of economics, of military policy. You have to be aware of those things. Socrates' argument is it doesn't make sense to entrust a whole population with the ignorance among them and others with this choice, yes, of being able to choose the representative. He said that, or the policies. So it doesn't make any sense.
Do we ever choose?
Yeah. No. So, do you see what I'm saying? So, the truth is this. That's one issue. The second issue is as follows. But then you have, for example, first past the post. Point is this. Is one person's vote the same? Is my vote the same as your vote? For example, let's say I supported the Labour Party and you supported the Green Party, yeah? If you went to the ballot box and you went and chose the Green Party and I went and chose the Labour Party, my vote is much stronger than your vote. It's not one person, one vote. Why? Because of first past the post, the electoral system. So I have here the issue that Socrates mentioned, that everyone is not expert in democracy. Number two, the issues with democracy. Yeah, the way that first past the post works in any it's an electoral system. It's called first past the post. It amplifies the votes of the higher parties.
So that means you're not voting?
Yeah, so it means, say for example, you get, and this is arbitrary, I'm not giving you actual numbers. Say 10% of the population or 15% of the population voted for the Conservative Party. And say 15% of the population or 10% voted for the Labour Party, yeah? And then 5% of the population voted for or 3% voted for the Green Party. The Labour Party, who's got 15% of the votes of the population, would get maybe 40% of the seats. So it wouldn't get 15%, it would get 40% of the seats in Parliament. Which means that 15% of the votes amounts to, let's say, 40% of the... See, again, this is arbitrary, but that's the way it works. Now, if that's the way it works, how comes this country voted against AV? AV, which is what the Liberal Democrats wanted, is when you have lower votes. So it's more proportionate. So my vote is worth more, like, proportionately more to your vote. Do you understand what... Maybe it's a bit complicated. Okay, sorry. First past the post... Alright. First past the post is an electoral system, which means that bigger parties have a higher chance of being elected. Bigger parties like the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. Or in America, the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. Yeah?
Who controls all those parties together? Do you know what I mean? Who's more empowered than all those parties?
No one is. No one
Is
is.
there a party more powerful?
No. So whoever wins becomes the government. Yeah. Anyways, just the point is, it's not a full democracy, right? So the one vote, one person thing is not what happens. By capitalistic necessity, one person's actions in society is not going to be the same as another person's actions. If you have more money than me, you're going to have more power than me. Okay. So pluralism is not actualized. Democracy is not actualized. Democracy, even if it was actualized, it wouldn't be. You couldn't argue that it's an objectively perfect place because you know that. Democracy is mob rule. You have problems of and people of democracy. They even mention this. They call it the problems of tyranny of the majority, where you have literally mob rule. Say, for example, you got 70% of people that vote on something, 30% of people that vote on another thing. The 30% is disregarded. The 70% is actually actualized. So it's not to do with what everyone wants. Everyone is not equal.
That's fair if you think about it, because the 30% is less than the 70%.
Yeah, I understand this, but at the end of the day, if our premise is egalitarian or equality, then what should happen is at every juncture there should be equality. So my political ambition should be actualized in an exactly equal way as your political ambition. Now, if you're saying that actually it's not going to be like that because we're going to choose the majority, then it's not equality. You can either have democracy or equality. You can't have both. You can either have capitalism or equality. You can't have both. Do you get it?
In most cases,
This is just a way. So basically, the point I'm making is this: the liberal system is not only critiqued by people, but it's actually not feasible. You can't have a completely liberal democratic society. That's why there are trade-offs at every juncture. That politicians and societies must make. So for someone to come and say, okay, let's make Islam democratic, or let's make Islam liberal, or let's make Islam whatever. Say, look, it's not even being actualized in your own space, in your own domain. Let alone you coming and trying to impose it on us. It doesn't work. It's a useful system for people that don't have morals. Let me tell you one more time. Democracy and liberals is a useful system for people that don't have any objective moral basis. It's not useful if you know the truth. If you know the truth, it's not useful. Pardon?
isn't morality subjective?
It's subjective for those who believe it's subjective, right? It's objective for those who believe it's objective. For us as Muslims, we have an objective outlook on Islam. We say it's true. So look, what I'm saying is, with democracy and liberalism and all these things, in the context of a Western world, in the Western world that we live in, and the Western Europe, whereby we don't know the truth, right? We need always to ask about what the truth is and have some kind. We need a mechanism to sort epistemic truths. So democracy becomes that mechanism, right? But if you know the truth, we don't need to vote on it. If you know, okay, look, do you see what I'm saying here? Does that make no sense?
What system would you say that,
The Islamic system, we have, do you know what's really interesting about the Islamic system? You have Ahlul Halli wal Aqdi, which is basically the people who, as we said, Socrates, as he said that not everyone's proficient or professional enough to be able to vote. So Islam doesn't allow the non-proficient people to have an input.
Who decides?
So I'll tell you, Ahlul Halli wal Aqd are the people who are basically the elites. Elites not in necessarily the economic capitalistic way, it could be academic elites. It could be people who are most intelligent, the people who are most qualified to understand things.
Intelligence as well.
Yeah, so those who have come up the academic ladder, or so the scholars of society basically. Yeah. Now, this would mean those individuals would decide, okay, who should be in charge. But hold on, there's another aspect of it. There's two aspects. There's two aspects. One aspect, and this is very powerful actually. I believe this mechanism is a much more powerful mechanism than what we have. Number one, the experts decide who should be put up. And by the way, this is done in democratic societies.
The expert.
Yes,
But
just like, for example, did we decide that Theresa May should be the leader of the Conservative Party? Did we decide that? Did we decide when he was that Ed Miliband should be the leader of the Labour Party? No one decided. Who decided? Labour Party decided. So why did they decide? Because it was expected that they would have more political understanding of who should be the leader of their own parties. You could argue that the leader of the party is as important as the leader of the country, because they're making a decision as who should be the leader of the party. Same thing, the Republicans will make a decision that Donald Trump should be the leader of the party. That made a massive distinction for us, yeah? So we would say, Ahlul Halli wal Aqdi would decide who should be the leader. Now,
Ahlul Aqdi decide themselves to be leaders when they make
no, they can't. That's a good point. That's a good question. They can't decide that they themselves will be the leader.